All right, I think we're going to start. Um, on behalf of the Heurich House Museum and the Bipartisan Policy Center, thank you everyone so much for joining us this afternoon for our program Once Upon an American Dream, which is the first in a three-part panel series exploring the stages of the immigration experience in America. Today we're focusing on the theme of migration, and future discussions will contemplate the arrival and integration experiences of American immigrants, and we'll give you the dates for those at the end. My name's Kim Bender. I'm the Executive Director of the Heurich House Museum in Washington, D.C., and our museum is located in the DuPont Circle historic home of D.C.'s most successful brewer, who himself was an immigrant. He was a German immigrant named Christian Heurich. And when we first imagined this program, it was supposed to take place in our conservatory with beer. Hopefully you all have some beers with you at home. And it's because of our awesome partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center that we were able to quickly change to this digital format. So thank you to them. I was really thrilled when Teresa agreed to do this with us because this was a way for us as a museum to pivot to our new mission that focuses on exploring the concept of the American dream. And I'm not sure the idea of the American dream can exist without the people who've chosen to come here from other places seeking a better life, which is most of us and our ancestors. Now we're going to roll a little video that's going to talk about Christian Heurich's migration experience to America after the Civil War and give us a little bit of a historic perspective.
In an alternate, pandemic-free reality, we would all be sitting together in an old historic house in the DuPont Circle neighborhood of Washington, D.C., the Heurich House Museum, sipping local beer in the conservatory and having the same discussion we're having this evening. This was the home of German-American immigrant brewer Christian Heurich. His brewery, which sat near the current site of the Kennedy Center, was the largest in D.C. and operated for nearly a century from 1872 until 1956. The interiors of his home are now something like a time capsule of life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Heurich family lived there from 1894 until 1956. Here you can see his third wife Amelia and his 3 kids. When things open back up, come on a tour and we'll tell you all the interesting details of their unusual lives. Today, using Heurich's own experiences as an immigrant as inspiration, we use the house to honestly explore what it takes to achieve the American dream and to create a just path to success for modern, local, small creative entrepreneurs. Our programs include historic tours, festivals like an annual Christmas market featuring local craft vendors, and Oktoberfest featuring local breweries, and a small creative business incubator with low-cost studio space. As we explore the theme of migration during this program, why do people choose to leave the place of their birth and settle in another place? We thought Heurich's 19th century immigration journey would be a helpful place to start. In 1842, Christian Heurich was born in the Saxon Duchy of Saxe-Meiningen, now part of Thuringen, just north of the Bavarian border. His parents were brewers and tavern keepers, and he grew up working daily in the tavern. Orphaned by the time he turned 14 and siblings scattered, he was apprenticed as a butcher brewer and journeyed around Europe for the next 10 years of his life, landing in Vienna, a city he fell in love with. Vienna sort of had me enslaved with its charm, its manner of living. I seemed to want nothing more, he recounted in his autobiography called I Watched America Grow. Heurich's sister Elizabeth had immigrated to America with the wealthy family that took her in after their parents died, and had then married a ship captain and settled in Baltimore. She tried to lure Christian away from Vienna, perhaps to fight in the Civil War, as Heurich suspected. He resisted for a while. This is how Heurich described what brought him to America. But with the arrival of peace in the States, Elizabeth became more insistent. Germans, she said, were opening breweries all over the country. Americans were getting into the way of dropping strong drink, such as brandy and whiskey, and going in for the lighter, healthier, and more sustaining beverages introduced and almost daily being improved by my countrymen. You will never own your own brewery in Vienna, she wrote, but here, in this wonderful country, you will at least have the opportunity for success. In April of 1866, with the idea of owning my own brewery uppermost, I journeyed from Vienna to Hamburg, where I took a freight steamer to Grimsby in England. My passage had been taken on the Cunard steamer Helvetia out of Liverpool. Here's an ad for the Helvetia. It was actually not a Cunard ship, but one from Norway's national line. As a strange side note, Heurich's first attempt to immigrate to America ended in failure when the Helvetia broke out in cholera and had to turn around. The tale of this journey was one of the many self-promotional stories he told throughout his life. He swore that he survived the journey in complete good health because he only drank beer, understanding that you should never drink water on a ship.
I am delighted to introduce our moderator now, who has been so fabulous to work with. Teresa Cardinal-Brown is BPC's Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. Previously, she was Director of Immigration and Border Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Associate Director of Business Immigration Advocacy at the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and was a policy advisor in the Office of the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. In 2005 and 2006, she became a member and later director of the Immigration Legislation Task Force in the Department of Homeland Security Office of Policy. She then served as the first DHS Director of Canadian Affairs and subsequently as the first DHS attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much for the video. Welcome everyone to, as Kim said, this first in a new panel discussion series, Once Upon American a Dream. During this three-part series, we'll look at the migrant experience, past and present, including the migrant journey, the migrant arrival and reception, and how immigrants integrate into their new homes. I'm happy to be the moderator this evening, and I just want to tell you a little bit about BPC for those who aren't familiar with us. We are a think tank here in DC that is based on the idea of bipartisanship. We were founded by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Bob Dole, Tom Daschle, George Mitchell, and Howard Baker. And we work to bring parties together to develop practical solutions to the country's biggest problems, immigration being one of them. As Kim said in the video, we do hope to have this series in person in the future at Heurich House, as well as online as a happy hour event. So I invite you now, if you so choose, to pour yourself your favorite happy hour beverage and join us for what I think will be a very interesting discussion. A few housekeeping notes. If you're watching this in Zoom, you have the opportunity to post questions to the panel via the Q&A window. If you hover over the bar at the bottom of your screen and click Q&A, you'll be able to ask a question. Our staff will forward those questions to us, and we'll try to respond to them a bit later in the program. If you're watching via the webcast on YouTube or on the BPC website, you can send questions to us via Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive or the hashtag OnceUponAmericanDream. You've already met Kim Bender of the Heurich House Museum, and now I am happy to welcome our other panelists. Let me first introduce Alan Kraut. Alan Kraut is University Professor of History at American University here in Washington, D.C., and a non-resident fellow of the Migration Policy Institute. He specializes in immigration and ethnic history, as well as the history of medicine in the United States. And he is the author or editor of 9 books and many scholarly articles. And his knowledge of immigration and immigration history in the United States, I would say, is unparalleled. Next, we have Abel Nunez. Abel is Executive Director of Caresen, which is an immigrant serving organization in Washington, D.C. area. He has been its Executive Director since March of 2013. And prior to this, he was Associate Director of Centro Romero in Chicago, Illinois. He himself is a migrant from El Salvador to the United States in the 70s, and he grew up in the District of Columbia. Caresen, as an organization's mission is to foster the development of the Latino population in the Washington metropolitan area by providing direct services, promoting grassroots empowerment, civic engagement, and human rights advocacy. So I just want to thank them for joining us today for this event. Thank you both. So we heard a little bit of Christian Heurich's immigrant story, and I'm going to turn first to Professor Kraut and ask him to tell us how common was the story you heard of Christian Heurich for migrants of the time? What was the story of migrants at the time in the mid-1800s when he joined, when he came to the United States, and how common is that story that we heard from him?
Thank you, Teresa. Christian Heurich's story is a very typical story for those coming in the period before the Civil War. The United States was getting a great deal of immigration from Northern and Central Europe. Millions of Irish and Germans were coming to the United States for economic opportunity. And in the case of the Germans, those who were escaping the failed revolutions of the 1840s. And they were coming via sailing ship. It took about a month to 5 weeks to get across the Atlantic at that point. And when they came filled with hope, much more hope often than financial resources. Many were starting at the very, very bottom. But this country was in desperate need of labor and skilled artisans and craftsmen. It was a good time to come to the United States. And in fact, the United States was often attempting to recruit labor in the coffee houses and taverns of Europe. And so when Christian Heurich was arriving, it was at a time when there was a great deal of opportunity for ambitious folks coming to make their way in America.
Thank you very much. So let's talk a little bit about sort of maybe a little more history. So when migrants came in the early to mid 1800s, you said they were coming from Germany, mostly from Europe. Take us a little bit further into American immigration history here. You know, we've had different periods of immigration and from different eras. How did things change from them to where we are now?
Well, those who came in the 1840s, between 1840 and 1860, again, 4.5 million immigrants into an economy that was not yet industrialized, where there was a great deal of commercial opportunity, but it was not an industrialized country. By the time of late 19th century, we were an industrializing country. The Civil War had spurred on industrialization. Factories were opening up, plants were opening up, and now we needed a variety of different kinds of labor. Skilled labor of the kind that Heurich brought, but also unskilled labor in great quantities. And between 1880 and the 1920s, 23.5 million newcomers arrived. They were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were coming from China and Japan. They were coming across our southern border from Mexico. They were coming down from Canada into the New England states. It was a very busy time for those on the move. And not just to the United States either. There were migrants during this era who were coming to Argentina and Brazil, to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, and so on. All the countries that were experiencing this surge in industrialization were also experiencing and in fact encouraging a surge in immigration because they needed the labor. That wave of immigration in the late 19th century was very, very formative and determinative of the direction the United States would take until after World War I. By the early 1920s, Congress decided that yes, we had had enough immigration for a while, and they passed very highly restrictive immigration legislation. By 1924, we were really ringing down the curtain on mass immigration to the United States. And with the coming of the Depression and then the Second World War, there was a kind of hiatus in migration to the United States. We did not really liberalize our immigration laws until well after the Second World War, until 1965, when we, saw the Hart-Sellers Immigration Act and really turned around our notion of restriction from a national quotas origin system to a hemispheric quota system, which was much more generous. Not just to Europeans, but to people coming from other parts of the world. And in fact, if one had to turn to look at the legislation that's currently in play, that's the dominant legislation, it's still the 1965 legislation with some changes in the 1970s and 1980s.
Thank you. So he was describing the time when you migrated to the United States, listening to the story of Christian Heurich, listening to some of that history. Talk about our newest migrants, the migrants who've come in the second half of the 20th century and who are coming today. What are the what are the primary drivers that bring them to the United States, and what are the reasons they want to come?
Yeah, well, thank you, Theresa, and welcome everyone to the webinar. Yes, so the migration after the 1965 legislation begins to turn into more of a Latin American migration, more of an Americas migration. But you also see in the late 70s, there's a lot of upheaval in particular in Central America. And a lot of this upheaval was in large or in some part due to American intervention. So you had places like El Salvador, like Nicaragua, like Honduras, where the U.S. and Guatemala as well, where the U.S. was imposing its hemispheric policy of control, but that created and put in place governments that are very oppressive. And so unfortunately, people, like in the past, that could no longer live in their countries of origin, looked elsewhere for success. And so many made a difficult decision to come to the US. And so you had a huge influx of Central Americans coming in the late 80s, really fleeing a civil war. But I think with less of a fanfare or a welcome, I think many immigrants at first have not really found the red carpet rolled out for them. But for these later immigrants, they weren't even given refugee status. They were really were being prevented from entering. And I think that given the massive influx also of Mexican nationals, which were right at our border, created sort of this dynamic of sort of the bad immigrant, what we're currently hearing from our current president when he was candidate. But I do think that some of the reasons that they came are very similar to previous generations with their own struggles as they're making their way and enriching our nation, right? And so I think every generation has to go through it. This generation is going through it. We're fighting through it. So the laws that we're seeing being put in place now are no different than the laws that were put in place during the Depression, and during other times that excluded whether there were immigrants from China or other groups that weren't deemed. I mean, at one point, I think German immigrants were considered not the greatest ones, right? One of our great forefathers, Benjamin Franklin, thought that they were less than deserving of becoming to America. So I think that the struggle has continued, but I think that the story remains the same of why people continue to come to this country.
So Kim, when you talk about the story of Christian Heurich, and Abel mentioned that it wasn't always true that we thought of Germans as acceptable in this country as migrants, and he had some mixed reception at various times, obviously living through World War I when Germany was the enemy of the United States. But I also know that in his story, he didn't come first to the United States, right? He immigrated around Europe first and then managed to make his way to the United States. Can you talk a little bit about those issues?
He was orphaned when he was 14 years old, and he and his siblings were scattered. So he had to find his way, and it was either join the military and stay or find a different route, and he chose to leave. So he, at 14, was apprenticed around as a butcher and brewer. So he traveled all across Europe. It's hard to tell completely the accuracy of some of his statements, because everything we get comes from his autobiographies where he talks very highly of himself. But we know that he crossed the Alps he says he crossed the Alps by foot and traveled around for many years, ended up in Vienna when he was 24 years old and fell in love with Vienna. By that point had picked up all of the brewing skills that one would need potentially to have their own brewery. And as we said in the video, his sister, who had moved to America previously, sort of lured him with the idea that he would have a much better opportunity opening his own brewery in America than he ever would in Europe. And I think that was very true at the time. And when he landed, we'll talk more about that the next time, but when he landed, he did find a huge German-American community that was so welcoming that he almost had to detach himself from them to learn English. So we can talk about that next time. But,
sure.
yeah.
So Abel, you know, Heurich was an orphan. We have heard an awful lot in the last few years about unaccompanied children who migrate to the United States, sometimes through treacherous overland routes, whether we believe Heurich crossed the Alps on foot or not. We know there are children of that age and younger who are crossing thousands of miles through Central America and through Mexico to come to the United States. Do you see and hear similarities in these stories?
To a certain extent. I think that one difference is what we're beginning to see now is forced migration. So people having to leave their countries of origin because they can no longer live there. I mean, it's actually a detriment to their lives to stay there. And so what we saw with the unaccompanied minor crisis that began under the Obama administration was the violence that was happening in particularly the countries of what we call the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, which their crime rates are incredibly high, but they also target youth. And so youth became enemy number one in those nations. And those, unfortunately, young people had only two choices: either stay, particularly if they were coming from the lower economic classes. Now, like everywhere else, anyone that has means is able to stay and thrive. So we're really looking at the folks that are the poorest of those countries that had no other option. I mean, most of the studies demonstrate that most of the immigrants, including those youth that were coming, actually move 5 times within their country of origin before they decide to make the trip to the U.S., which is very arduous. And people often wonder, it's like, why would they even risk this horrible trek to the U.S. with the beast in Mexico climbing on top of a rail car? But the reality is that what they have in their home country is even worse, or certain death. So when people judge, I stay in my country of origin and die, or go on this trek and hope that I would make it to a better place and thrive, people will take that chance, right? And so the migration that started in the early 80s cemented a huge enough community in the U.S., particularly in the District of Columbia and the DMV area, and a lot of the metropolitan areas of Houston, Los Angeles, that then you had both a pull and a push factor. You had people that couldn't live there, but you also had people that were already were living here. Kind of like in the past, you found your community that helped you traverse what it meant to come to the U.S., that helped you getting employment, that helped you learn the language and understand how you thrive and survive in the U.S.
Yeah.
So it's very similar.
Yeah. So Alan, talk to me a little bit about this concept of diaspora, of folks who have migrated before and how they sort of help settle, and then more from the countries. That's not new or unique. It happened. Christian Heurich's sister brought him, but that's been happening for a lot of our history, correct?
Yeah, that's a chain migration in which people from a particular area come to a place in the United States and bring others, bring relatives, bring friends. And this chain migration is a very common pattern, and it was even facilitated by the 1965 legislation that prioritized family reunification. So this is not something that's new to us. It's something we've seen before. But I wanted to respond to Abel's point about those who were forced to leave. This is not a unique pattern. Among those who came, especially during the late 19th and early 20th century, you had Eastern European Jews who had suffered tremendous violence in the pogroms of Eastern Europe, and who are in flight for their lives and looking for someplace else to go. And sometimes they went to other countries. They ended up in France, or they ended up in England, or they ended up elsewhere, and then made their way to the United States. So the United States was not the primary area of settlement, but a secondary or tertiary area of settlement. But what they were looking for primarily was relief from religious and political oppression. Mm-hmm. And even during the time of Christian Heurich, those Germans who had participated in the failed revolutions of the 1840s, especially 1848, were looking for a place to land because they were being pursued. They too were looking for a safe haven from persecution. So this is a very, very common pattern. And during the period that we're talking about, the more recent period, we have people fleeing Southeast Asia to the United States in the 1970s at the same time that people were fleeing from Nicaragua and other areas. Hmong tribesmen, people fleeing the Khmer Rouge from Cambodia. I mean, a tremendous number of people who are, again, fleeing because they have to flee for their lives. So this is a sort of a very common and repetitive pattern in American migration history.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that strikes me is thinking, again, going back to sort of the country's founding. I mean, the original settlers, many of them were people who were looking for freedom from some sort of oppression, whether it's religious oppression or we had our fair share of people who were fleeing letters of marque from the king in England who came to our shores as well. So this is, I think, something that's consistent across our history, is that the United States, America, is seen as this place of protection, a place of opportunity, a place of safe haven, and a place for a better life. And Kim, it sounds very much that maybe Christian Heurich really liked Vienna, but he thrived once he got to the US. Like, it really did turn out that way for him, correct?
Yes, I think it ended up being the land of opportunity for him. And part of that was the people that had come from Germany and had paved the way right before him. So he was able to open a brewery and introduce lager beer to a population that wasn't used to this easy drinking beer. So he had a product to sell. And there was a community here waiting for him. So it was, I think, a better, more golden shores than Vienna even could be, even though he loved it there.
Yeah. So Abel, your organization is that community welcome, right? It is that immigrants helping immigrants. Talk to us a little bit about the work you do and why it's so important. Why is it important for immigrant communities to have that empowerment?
Yeah, so when you think about the US model of how it integrates its immigrants, it really, government plays a very small role in it, right? So it's about the communities that they come into. So it's really, it's their own family members, it's their own community members from the country of origin that begin to teach them what it is to be in America. Now, the one thing I would say that's a little bit different from particularly a non-European migration is that all of those European nations eventually end up being part of the dominant culture. When you look at particular people of color, there's a little bit of a difference in that we always are something hyphenated. Although we still have Irish Americans and Italian Americans, by and large, they become part of the dominant culture. But as we've seen with Chinese Americans that have been here from since almost the inception of this nation, they still are sort of treated a little bit separate. And I think that that's part of our legacy of what our nation is. But I do think that is something that we need to kind of work. But the U.S. does allow you to kind of push that. And I think from almost every other nation that you come from, any immigrant that comes or any immigrant group that comes allows to add its own flavor, but also change the dynamic of who we are as a nation, right? And I think that's very different than in other places. When you go to Europe, when you see countries that have existed for hundreds of years and that have an incredible rich history, it's sometimes rigid in the sense of who they are. But our definition of who we are is around our value system. And as new communities come in, we add a piece of that to the tapestry that America is. And so just like the German Americans came in, the Latin Americans doing that now, and every wave of migration have added something that makes this nation one of the greatest nations on the earth.
Yeah. And I know our next panel event is going to talk a lot more about sort of how migrants are accepted when they arrive, but let's talk a little bit more about, since we're there right now, we'll talk a little bit more about that right now. Alan, this idea of different migrant groups who come to the United States from different parts of the world for various reasons, and how they integrate or how they become part of America. I think Abel mentioned certainly there have been Asians as part of America since very early on in our country's history, and yet we still hyphenate them to a certain extent. I mean, the United States has maybe an up and down relationship, right? We have this idea of being the nation of immigrants, of that history of immigrants coming and succeeding, and yet sometimes we don't live up to that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
There was an old immigrant saying in the 19th century, translated into many different languages, and it was America beckons, but Americans repel. And I think there's certainly a lot of truth to that even today, where the United States courts immigrants either for their labor or their special talents, and wants to offer opportunity, economic opportunity, and sometimes freedom from religious persecution. But not all Americans are welcoming. And there's often a wall that's placed that needs to be scaled by newly arrived immigrants to achieve acceptance. And it comes down only after several generations of existing in the United States. I mean, that's kind of a truth also about life in America, is that it's not always immediately welcoming. One has to carve out one's place in this nation of nations. The other part about this too is the complexity of the role that government plays with respect to newly arrived immigrants. The United States has had immigration policy since the 1890s. Before then, it was largely state policy. But it has never had immigrant policy. And by that, I mean a policy in which the federal government supports language learning, job retraining on a big scale for all newcomers, and offers a lot of opportunities that are financed by the federal government. If you want to learn English when you come to the United States, there may be programs that are sponsored by churches, by municipalities, by a variety of civic organizations, but the government of the United States does not pay to teach people English, nor does it pay to retrain newly arrived immigrants for the job market in the United States. Contrast that with other societies that do make that effort and that do have programs that are reasonably well financed to promote that integration. And so part of the challenge of coming to America is not just overcoming the negative feelings that many of your hosts may have toward you, but also carving out the opportunities that you're going to need to succeed and to help the next generation, to make sure that your children and your grandchildren get the education that they need to thrive in the United States. It's a much more complicated problem than many other societies pose.
Yeah. So that idea that by migrating to the United States, you might do better, but also this idea that your kids might do better, the next generations. There's a continuity there. Abel, from your community, is that an important idea also, that you're doing it not just for yourself, but for your family, for your children, for the next generation?
Definitely, and I would say that my personal story. So when my family decided to migrate to the U.S. was specifically for that, because my dad was gainfully employed. My mother was a housewife in El Salvador, but my aunt had come to the U.S. in the 60s, was already established, and told my father, if you want better opportunities for your children, you should take this opportunity. And he uprooted his entire family, his entire life, and made the decision to come to the U.S. Right. So I think that the first generation is the one that sort of pays the entry fee, right, for the rest of the generations. And the idea is that your second generation will do better. I think one of the things that has happened with the recent migration, and I think that has to do also with technology as well, is the fact that a lot of the immigrants also sustained their families in the countries of origin that they left, right, with remittances. And so you have sort of families that come in and are trying to make life better for themselves here and their next generation, but are also taking care of the families in the countries that they left, so that you have sort of a dual responsibility as an immigrant. I mean, I think that as Carecen is the role that we play to help people integrate, to make sure that they, with the services that we provide, that they're able to navigate, particularly around language and around legal aspects of immigration, to ensure that they get a foothold here so that the next generation does better.
Yeah. I was reading something recently that talked about that many migrant families see the migration as an investment. It's an investment in their own human capital, but an investment in the future of their families, that by migrating, they can make that investment for the rest of their family, both here and back home. Do you agree with that perspective?
Yes, actually, even when you look at folks in El Salvador from the, which are the poorest, when they make a decision of who travels to the US, they make very intentional decisions to choose the family member that they think will survive the route all the way to the US and will be able to be gainfully employed so they can send money back. It is their way of connecting to a globalized economy. And so even some of the decisions beyond those that are made for fleeing violence, but when they're trying to connect to a better life, families in El Salvador, in Central America, are making decisions of who is best equipped to be successful in the US because of their age, their gender, the skills that they may have, that they might be productive, and then help the family back home.
Yeah. So one of the decisions, obviously, and it's been different throughout our history, is the means of migration. So, Christian Heurich, there were boats that would take you to America and you just sort of come, and maybe there was a process to enter, but it wasn't nearly as complex as it was today. Kim, can you talk a little bit about, did he have to file applications or get a visa before he came to the United States, or did he literally just buy a ticket on a boat?
Everything we know is that he just bought a ticket. He decided, I think maybe he just saw the ad, he seemed like that would be the kind of decision he would make. And he traveled over to Liverpool to take the ship.
Yeah. So Alan, obviously the mechanisms of migration have changed a lot. There were boats at that time that were advertising, come to America and, come on our ship and you can make it in America. Now we have really complicated systems of whether or not somebody can come in and get a visa or work or have qualifications. Can you talk a little bit about how those systems have evolved?
Yeah, if you are talking about Christian Heurich's moment, the states were controlling migration. There was no paperwork to fill out. You bought a ticket, you got on the ship, and if you were lucky, you got off at the other end in reasonably good shape. There was no bureaucracy. There were state immigration officers in busy ports like New York and Boston and Philadelphia and New Orleans and so on, but that was it. By the late 19th century, when the federal government gets into the immigration business, a bureaucracy has to be shaped and a process has to be launched. And that's what we see happening at places like Ellis Island in New York or Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. Those are immigration depots. They're manned by federal officers who are conducting interrogations. They're manned by officers of the U.S. Marine Hospital Service, physicians who conduct a physical inspection of immigrants. There's a process through which they must pass, and there's some paperwork. There are passes that are issued to them as they come into the United States. Life gets even more complicated, of course, in the 1920s when we passed this restrictive legislation, and now immigrants need to get paperwork done before they depart from Europe to the United States. There's a need for an interview with a consular official. There's a visa that must be issued to come to the United States. And life gets much more complicated and never really gets uncomplicated again. If anything, there's more and more paperwork to be done, more and more assurances to be given. But this is all a product of Americans wishing to screen who comes to the United States. Will the folks who are arriving in the United States be able to make a positive contribution to the economy? Will they be able to support themselves? Will they become public charges and in need of charity? And so the United States begins to create a mechanism for that, but also as a way of excluding criminals, people who we regard as immoral, and also those who are politically unpopular. Whether we're talking about anarchists in the late 19th and early 20th century, or later communists during the early and mid 20th century, the United States is screening for politics, even as it's screening for economic capability. And all of that involves investigation, all of it involves paperwork, and the marshaling of a bureaucracy to do all of that.
Yeah, and it's gotten a lot harder since, if you will. And Abel, just coming back to you really quick, I mean, all of that bureaucracy also means limitations, right? It means challenges for people who want to immigrate here if they can't participate in that process, if that process is not available to them. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, that is correct. You know, the system has become one that you have to be of means to access it, right? Not only here in the US, but from the country of origin, right? So for example, if you have millions of dollars to invest, it's very easy to come to the US. But if you are a laborer, that becomes much more difficult. And I think that has created sort of this sort of strange bipolar way where yes, it's becoming harder to become in terms of legally, but because of technology, people are coming that much quicker, whether it's through land, through sea, through air. You know, people can come, and the connectivity that we have, you know, we're much more of a globalized nation. So what you have is people here basically educating people in the countries of origin of what they need to do to come in here, whether they do that legally or not following the current rules that are in place. Whether you see them as fair, unfair, right or wrong, the fact of the matter is that those rules exist, and so they become much more complicated, particularly when you also are bringing in people that may not be educated and may not have the means. And so it becomes a place where it becomes a marketplace, really, for operators to work in that, to bring people to do the human trafficking, but also within the legal sphere of people that help shepherd people through this process. Now, we're part of that chain because we help people once they get here to be able to make sure that they navigate the system and be able to get to the best conclusion possible for them.
So we have several questions that have come in via Q&A, so I'm going to start asking those of the panel. And a lot of them are about sort of the current politics of immigration. So, you know, feel free to answer as best you can, as best you wish. But first question, I think, Abel, you mentioned this at the beginning of when you were talking about, says, what role do you think U.S. foreign policy has played in Central American migration to the United States over the last 3 to 4 decades? And I think, you know, Alan, I might ask you, you know, American interventions in lots of parts of the world have probably prompted migration to the United States as well. So Abel, if you want to talk about Central America first, and then maybe I'll ask Alan to talk about other migration.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that you have to learn, like if you've seen where the U.S. has, their armies have been, you'll see populations here in the U.S., right? And that's across the country. But for Latin America, particularly in Central America, it has been pivotal. You know, for example, Salvadorians have had a migration history to the U.S. We have recorded Salvadorians coming in for the gold rush in San Francisco, but they were small numbers. But the real sort of explosion of migration came in the 80s when the Civil War sort of exploded in El Salvador, and it's somewhere where the U.S. was heavily involved. They spent about $1 million a day in military aid for 12 years to sustain that war. And that has consequences. You see that, you can talk that about Nicaragua, the same thing for Guatemala and what happened in the 50s and when they try to do regime change there. You can talk about the Dominican Republic. You can talk about, so many countries where the U.S. has exerted their foreign policy, which has had consequences. I mean, Cuba is a perfect example, right? We've had this ongoing battle with them, and that is right now the fourth largest Latino community. The Salvadoran is the third largest Latino community in the U.S. And part of that, it is because of the U.S. foreign policy to those particular countries for their own, the U.S. self-interest. Again, it's not about arguing whether those interests were right or wrong. It's the fact that they were there. And that in of itself caused the ability and the instability that then led people to make decisions to travel. And because of the relationships that existed, one of the first places, or not the first, but maybe second or third that they decided to come was the U.S. And so that this is where we see the growth of a Central American community in the U.S., a Cuban community in the U.S., a Dominican community in the U.S., and so forth and so forth.
Unmute. Sorry. Alan, talk a little bit about, Abel talked a lot about Central America, but you were talking earlier about Asian migration to the United States and, post-Vietnam War, post-World War II, Korea, lots of diasporas from those places as well, correct?
Yeah, I mean, to put this in its broadest perspective, think about 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which brings to a conclusion the Mexican War. What happens as a result of that? Those who are living in the territories that are going to be part of the Mexican cession to the United States have a choice. They can go across the border into what was then Mexico. They can stay where they are and become American citizens. And so, in a sense, they didn't migrate. The country engulfed them. And they were given the choice
of becoming them, is what they say.
That's right. The country came to them instead of the other way around. But every time the United States is involved in another area of the world, and we are involved in many areas of the world because we are, after all, in our own way, an imperial power, there is the result that newcomers arrive in the United States. When we open up trade with China and trade with Japan, the result is our migrations to the United States. When we get involved in Central and South America, the result is migrations to the United States. And so this is a constant theme of American migration history of who's coming after what kind of an involvement. We were talking a little bit about the 1970s, the post-1965 period anyway. And if you look at the early 1970s, what happens? In addition to the instability in Central America, which brings so many up through Mexico and across our borders, it's the end of the Vietnam War. And with the end of the Vietnam War, there's a surge in immigration from Southeast Asia, not just from Vietnam, but ethnic Chinese who are living in parts of Southeast Asia, who are coming not from just Vietnam, but from Laos and Cambodia as well. And so this is a constant movement of people in response to American involvement from abroad. And I have no doubt that it will continue that way for a long, long time. Wherever we see pockets of instability and American engagement, we're going to see migration.
Mm-hmm. So our next question, unfortunately, brings us a little bit back to reality and asks, how do you think the current pandemic will affect our immigration system? I would change that a little bit to affect migration generally. I mean, there's what we choose to do with our migration system in result to the pandemic, but there's also what the migrants choose to do in the midst of a pandemic. Alan, I'm going to ask you, I mean, there's so many comparisons happening right now to the 1918 Spanish flu or influenza outbreak. What was the migration aftermath of that, or was there one?
Well, now I'm going to put on my historians of medicine hat for a moment and talk a little bit about that, because the 1918 pandemic occurred during World War I and America's involvement in World War I. And migration to the United States had already slowed to a fraction of what it had been in 1914 before the war started, and so the pressure of migration coming to the United States was not nearly as great during the pandemic, simply because of wartime conditions. And the backlash against migrants coming to the United States was actually in some ways less during the pandemic, because so many recently arrived immigrants and their children were fighting in the American army. An enormous number of American soldiers were of immigrant background in World War I. One generation, 2 generations at most, removed from the immigrant experience. That's extraordinary. And so the kind of anti-immigrant sentiment that one might have suspected in its relationship to the epidemic was simply not there. What was there was a great deal of concern about how the newcomers would adjust to the authority of boards of health commissioners, of how, whether or not they would be a vulnerable population because they would attempt to defy authority and not social distance and not observe all of the rules of sanitation and hygiene that were being proffered. And the answer is that ethnic communities and community leaders and the leaders of the foreign language press were very instrumental in persuading the populations to follow the rules of the game, which involved some social distancing, which involved the wearing of masks, sound familiar, which involved an awful lot of the things that we're doing now to try and limit the spread of the coronavirus. And so that's where the intersection was. In addition, there was a lot of America's let's say, xenophobia poured out against the Germans because they were our enemies in the First World War. This is the period when certain school districts are banning the teaching of German. This is the period when sauerkraut is renamed Liberty Cabbage. This is a period of tremendous anti-German sentiment because they're the enemy. They're the bad guys. But in a sense, the other groups really weren't as targeted and certainly not blamed for the pandemic as immigrants sometimes were in other cases of epidemics and pandemics. Yeah. The blaming of the Italians for the 1916 polio epidemic, the reference to tuberculosis as the Taylor's disease or the Jewish disease, as it was sometimes called. I mean, this was disease was always a good excuse for xenophobia, a rationalization for xenophobia. Yeah. But oddly enough, less so in 1918 than at other moments in our history.
Interesting. Kim, talk a little bit about Christian Heurich. Obviously, he was here and living through that. He was operating, maybe he wasn't operating a brewery because I think we were still in Prohibition during that time, maybe. But, he was here, and how did he and his business react to what was going on then?
During World War I, you mean?
And the pandemic. We
actually don't know very much about how they reacted to the Spanish flu because they don't talk about it at all, which is very strange. But for World War I, 1917, 2 different things happened. America joined World War I against Germany, and also Prohibition came to Washington, D.C. So they're not disconnected from each other. And really, up until the time that America joined the war, German Americans were not considered enemies, and they had to become the enemy really fast. So there was some concerted effort in creating that enemy status. Heurich got caught up in that really early on. The Department of Justice came to his home, to his brewery, to his farm. It was actually one of the hardest things of his entire life, the way that he describes it. And then, Germans were the ones brewing the beer, and the temperance movement, which was already active, really was pushed full steam ahead by the connection between the enemy status and the brewing. So that's why Prohibition really got pushed forward. So for him, it was, you know, the hardest, 1917 was the hardest year of his life.
Abel, Alan mentioned something that I wanted to bring around to you, is that it was the immigrant communities and the leaders in the immigrant communities who helped their communities follow the health orders. I imagine that you and your organization are very involved in trying to help your community right now understand what's being asked of them and the health restrictions, try to do their best to follow them, get protection. How busy are you right now with all of that?
Yeah, well, extremely busy, because we have to sort of interpret what the policies from the municipal governments and the federal governments are, and how does it relate to their life. I think that sort of organizations like Aresen in the past have served that buffer, right? That intermediary that helps communities get the right information for them to sort of exist in their new homes. So for us, it's about educating people. I mean, we were coming to this year that not only, besides being later on in this year an election year, it is also a census year. So we were gearing up for all of that's sort of part of our day-to-day work. And on top of this, we get caught up in COVID. And what we have to remember, that COVID is not something that's happening to the immigrant community. It's happening to everyone, right? Everyone is being impacted. So just the fact that we're having this panel discussion virtually demonstrates how we are being impacted, and we're having to really create new ways of operating. And in the immigrant community is no different. Now I would like to say, just to bring it back a little bit, that, you know, in terms of how this is going to impact immigration, I think it's slowing it down because people are just closing borders. But the reality is, before COVID, at no time had there been a movement and displacement of people around the world, right? Because of all the upheaval that's happening. And so I think that will continue, because people tend to move when they can no longer exist in their country of origin. I think that our role, particularly in the U.S., in terms of the communities that we're receiving immigrants coming in, is to create the mechanisms of integration, right? And it's always this battle, because there's always this we versus them, and we're trying to at some point become the we. We want to be part of the we, but the dominant culture always pushes back and says, no, that's the them, and then we have to kind of earn our place. And it's unfortunate, but again, it's not a new story. It's a story that every group has had to fight. But I do think that throughout the history, we've shown how successful different communities have been, and continue to be, about integrating and making and adding, again, a new ingredient to this nation.
Yeah, well, you lead very nicely into what I think may be our last question. This question says, some research has shown that anti-immigrant sentiment is more forceful than pro-immigrant sentiment. So for those who are working with immigrants and for immigrants, well, first of all, I want to ask Alan, what do you think about that from a historical perspective? You know, obviously anti-immigrant sentiment is not new. We've talked about times and places in our history when you know, Abel mentioned the early Germans and Benjamin Franklin. So, like, what do you think? This is a thread throughout our history, but do you think that it's more powerful, or do you think that it's cyclical?
I think it's cyclical. A great historian once said, history never moves in circles, but sometimes in cycles. And I think that's true. I think anti-immigrant sentiment is a constant in American history. It's ironic that we call ourselves a nation of nations, and yet at the same time, this underlying theme never completely vanishes. It's always there. But it comes out and is prevalent and critical at certain moments in our history, moments of tension. We mentioned before the anti-German feeling associated with the First World War. One could mention the anti-German and anti-Japanese sentiment associated with the Second World War. One could mention all kinds of patterns in which a depression or a recession causes nativism and xenophobia to spike. That was certainly true from my perspective in 2008. The 2008 recession led to a spike in anti-immigrant sentiment, because when things are going bad and you can't reintegrate into the economy, and you don't have hopes that your children will do better than you have done, you've got to blame somebody. And so often in our history, that blame has been thrust at immigrant communities. And I'm very concerned that when the COVID-19 crisis is over, if we're still with the current administration, there will be an extension of efforts to exclude immigrants from the United States in very large numbers. I think it's the perfect moment for xenophobes to use the current situation or the issue of public health as an excuse for their anti-immigrant policies. And I think some of this is coming right out of the White House, even as we speak.
So it's interesting to me, and you mentioned we've had these periods in our history, and yet if you take the higher level view, we have accepted more immigrants, frankly, than any other country in the world, and we have been the most successful country in the world. So the counterfactual is there, if you want to believe it. But every time we feel like it's not going so well, we sort of look at immigrants and go, it must be their fault somehow. But
Well,
the reality doesn't match that if you look at the longer trend line.
the great historian Michael Kamen once said that the Americans are a people of paradox. And I think that's true. I think we are a people of paradox, and this is one of the examples to cite, that at the same time that we have been nourished by immigration, that we have thrived because of immigration, we very often are anti-immigrant and express these feelings of nativism or xenophobia at one and the same time that we laud and exalt immigrants from our past who have done great things for this country. And when you think about the COVID pandemic, and one thinks about other instances of health crises, I think back to the polio epidemics in the 1950s. Where would this country be if we had kept the parents of Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin out of the United States? Sabin himself was actually an immigrant, but the developers of the polio vaccine. And yet at the same time that we laud these immigrants and are grateful to them for their tremendous contribution, there is this stream of xenophobia that never quite dries up.
Yeah. Abel, I'm gonna turn to you here, because right now, at the same time that, maybe that we're seeing some anti-immigrant sentiment kick up, and yet the people who are out there working on the front line, so many of them are immigrants. And we have never been so dependent on immigrants in our fields and picking our produce and producing our meat, and the doctors and nurses and healthcare providers in our hospitals and nursing homes and elsewhere, the people packing our groceries at the stores. We've never been so dependent on them as we are now. What do you feel about this?
I mean, I think that part of what we're talking about is when there's a perceived threat that can be galvanized by one specific community. We saw that in the 9/11 attacks, right? The Muslim and Arab communities became sort of this lightning rod and represented the threat, right? I think with in general, we're at a moment in the history of the US where there's a huge seismic demographic shift, right? When we're becoming a minority majority nation, and some of the big cities are beginning to see that. And I think that is a threat to the dominant culture. And so then every immigrant of color becomes a threat, right? So, we're rapists, we're robbers, because we see a perceived threat, and it's really a fear, right? But the reality is that no, we're integrated into the communities. We are part of the communities. You can't separate. I always say, unfortunately, Latino immigrants, Arab immigrants, Muslim immigrants, we're part of the DNA of this nation. You can't just separate us out. And so yes, we are the ones that are cleaning the office buildings. We are the ones that are packing your groceries. We are the ones that are picking the fruit in the fields that we need. So when we're talking about the meat shortages, they are the ones in the front lines that, in large part, not 100%, but in large part, are immigrants that are in these factories, ensuring that our system works, that we have food in our tables, that our houses are clean, that our system functions. And so I think that that's always the struggle, right? And I think as people see that, to the extent that we can make people open their eyes, are like, yeah, you know, I have issues, but I do understand. So there's this divide between what you know in your mind and what you know in your, and what you feel in your heart. And I think that that's the struggle that we're continually fighting. And I think that for us at Carecen, we continue to fight that, to make sure to prove in numbers what we bring to this nation, but it's harder to fight what people are feeling in their hearts.
Yeah, I think that's true. Kim, I'm going to turn it back to you really quickly, but it seems to me that this tug of war that we have, that Christian Heurich represents sort of the great immigrant story. And going back to the theme, success in the American dream. He made the decision to come and to build a business that was successful and to support others. Abel and his family and his colleagues are doing the same thing today, in spite of all of the headwinds, right? And had been headwinds all along. So when we think about Once Upon an American Dream, I'm going to go back to that question. He had a dream. He came and was successful. Abel, your parents had a dream, and you had a dream, and you've been successful. Alan, my great-grandparents had a dream. Alan, I assume your ancestors had a dream. Do we still think the American dream is there? Is it still there?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking everyone.
I think people are still fighting for it, fighting to keep it alive. Some days it's harder than others.
That's true. Abel, Alan?
Yeah, I would say that yes, it is alive. I mean, is it difficult? Are there challenges? Yes, but if we look in history, there will always have been challenges. And I think to the extent that this dream remains alive, if we want it to still be alive, it is really up to us. Because the good thing about immigrants, every new generation brings a new set of energy and a belief in this system. And so I think that, yes, it will be alive and it will continue to be alive.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And I think the proof is the struggles and the suffering that people will undergo to get to the United States. It still is the land of dreams, the land of, that seems to be at least the land of almost endless opportunity. Whether it is or not is another matter. But the fact that people think it is, believe it is, and are willing to risk life and limb to get to the United States on our borders every day is proof positive that that dream continues to exist.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Abel. Kim, I'm going to turn it back over to you because this has been a great conversation. You want to wrap us up?
Yeah, thank you so much, Teresa. You are awesome. I just want to invite everyone to make sure that they put in their calendars the next two discussions that we're going to have on July 9th and October 14th, maybe virtually. I'm really hoping it's in person. And we will, we'll send out information about that really soon. And you can register again. We'll keep talking about this.
Yeah. So as we sign off here, we're going to post on, I want to give everybody a chance to plug. You have fabulous organizations represented here on this panel, the Bipartisan Policy Center, Heurich House Museum, Abel at Carecen, and Alan at the American University and Migration Policy Institute. We're going to show you how you can find out more information about all of our organizations and the work we do on the next slide. Our Twitter handles, if you want to follow the conversation with us there. But we want to thank everyone who signed in. Hopefully you enjoyed your happy hour drink. We're going to go off and get ours now. But thank you all for joining. We hope you join us again. And I definitely want to thank our panelists, Alan, Abel, Kim. Thanks so much for your partnership. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Kim.
And that concludes our program.
Good to see you, Abel.